Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Well, I'm doing a request again. Someone asked that I make a video about the alleged plot against Harold Wilson. So, first of all, who was Harold Wilson? Well, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister for the United Kingdom from October 1964 to June 1970, and again from February 1974 until April 1976. So, was the third ever Labour Prime Minister, and for a long time, well, there's the second longest serving Labour PM to serve for 8 years as the Prime Minister. The only one who did longer is Blair, who spent 10 years at the helm. Moreover, Wilson led the Labour Party for 13 years, which is, well, the same length of time as Blair, actually. Anyway, so Harold Wilson came from lower middle class family. He grew up in Huddersfield in Yorkshire. His father's an industrial chemist, was unemployed a lot during the Great Depression. So Wilson was born in 1916 into a family that was originally liberal. He'd been to Oxford University and studied at, I think it was Jesus was his college, and quickly became a Don. I believe he read PPE, and he was a Don at my college, at UNIV, University College Oxford, and I could even point out the rooms we used to live in, because he graduated about 1930 and he'd get a fellowship as being a lecturer straight away if you're very bright, which he did. Never did a doctorate. Very few people did doctorates who were academics back then. But that's by the by. So he was a civil servant during the Second World War. He was only 23 when the war broke out. And so that's why a lot of the top brass had it in for him, had felt disdain for him, someone who was perfectly healthy, who'd not served in the armed forces at all during the Second World War, but he would say, well, he was an outstanding mind, and he was told that his duty lay here in the civil service. He could do more for the war effort that way. Now, you might say, oh, come on, that's a rather self-serving excuse to have a cushy number and stay out of harm's way. Anyway, in 1945, he was elected in that Labour landslide to represent Huyton, which is a town just outside Liverpool, as he liked to say that the Beatles were almost constituents of his, and he held that seat till he stood down from Parliament at the 1979 election. So he rapidly rose up cursus honorum and was a cabinet minister within a couple of years. He married. He had 2 sons, I think, no daughters. Mary, his wife Mary, only died 2 years ago, astonishingly. He was not that much younger than him. His wife Mary, she was almost 100 when she died, if I got that right. So he had a happy family life, or did he? But anyway, was always going on holiday to the Scilly Isles, just off the southwest toe of England. Hello there, m'lady manners. So make sure you subscribe, people. I need subscribers. Thank you for your donations on Patreon and PayPal. Anyway, so Labour was out of office in 1951, very unlucky to lose that election. They got more of the votes, they got fewer of the constituencies. That's the way the cookie crumbles with the first past the post system. So the Conservatives were back under Churchill, who struggled on despite his strokes till 55, and handed over to Sir Anthony Eden. And having lost the 1955 election, Clement Attlee retired as leader of the Labour Party, a party headed for 20 years. And Hugh Gaitskell took over, a Wycomist, a former Oxford Don from a very affluent family. Though he was a socialist, believed in redistribution of wealth, he didn't redistribute his own wealth, Gaitskell, because by modern standards, he was a millionaire through inheritance. But anyway, he came across as unthreatening to Middle Britain, and spoke in that sort of a received pronunciation accent that the leaders were supposed to speak in. And he was very moderate and trying to get Labour to adopt more modern policies. Wilson was seen as a bit of a standard bearer for the left of the party at that time. Anyway, so the early 60s, the Conservative Party was in the doldrums, and it looked like Labour was going to win handily. They'd lost the 1959 election, possibly because of their opposition to the Suez misadventure. But anyway, Hugh Gaitskell, supposedly a fairly vigorous young man in his late 40s, dropped dead. Now, it might have been lupus, but I thought lupus, you see that coming, but it was actually a very sudden death. He was hale and hearty, and then he was gone. Although there is a suggestion that he was poisoned, and some of the symptoms of lupus can be caused by a certain poison, and there's this theory that the Soviet Union poisoned him. I don't know if that's true. I think it unlikely. I mean, it's not been debunked, but not many people credit that one. And then there was a leadership election at which Harold Wilson was elected quite handily. So then the Conservatives were spooked. In 1963, the Profumo scandal had hit the fan about the Minister for War, Jack Profumo, having an extramarital affair with Christine Keeler, who incidentally just died a few months ago. Christine Keeler, who was a prostitute, Mandy Rice Davies as well, but Miss Keeler was also being pumped for information by a Soviet diplomat, Colonel Yevgeny Ivanov. Well, they're their naval attaché. So the idea is that Profumo's pillow talk was leaking military secrets to Christine Keeler, who was passing them on to Ivanov. And Christine Keeler in the late 90s said that she was part of some sort of espionage ring. People laughed at to scorn at the time. These days, some people think that might not have been so ridiculous. There might have been something in that. But anyway, so the Conservatives were scandal struck. And though Harold Wilson stood down, partly had prostate problems, and Alec Douglas Hume became Prime Minister, as Wilson skewered within this line. After half a century of social advance, the Tory party is now led by a 14th Earl, because he was really the Earl of Hume. And he disclaimed his title. He'd been in the House of Lords, managed to get himself elected in a by-election, so was then in the House of Commons, because in the 1920s it had been laid down by George V that from now on the Prime Minister always had to be in the House of Commons. Until then, they mostly been in the House of Lords, because, Labour didn't have enough people in the Lords. It wouldn't be fair. Labour couldn't scrutinise a Prime Minister in the Lords properly. So Douglas Hume was Prime Minister for 1 year and 1 day. Then there was the election, and Labour, they thought they were barrelling towards a handsome victory. In fact, they just squeaked over the line, won 4 seats. So the Conservative Party did rather better than people had anticipated. The economy was going quite well. So Wilson was Prime Minister. It was the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been a couple of years before. There'd been a bit of a détente there. The conflict in Southeast Asia was hotting up. And the NATO alliance was there. And President Johnson, as a call for more flags, wanted the United Kingdom to send some troops to Vietnam. It doesn't have to be a significant number. He could say you could just send like the pipe band of the Black Watch or something, but something, just so I can tell the American public that we're not alone. There are a few Britishers there. It was 100 soldiers or it was 10,000 soldiers, doesn't really matter, but it just proves the point. But Wilson said he supported the American policy. There wasn't vociferation on his part in relation to that, but American policy gradually became more and more unpopular. So some people in Labour on the youth wing were increasingly disillusioned, felt it was too moderate, felt that what America was doing was grossly immoral. So it was a time of rising radicalism, of the counterculture, of people starting to smoke cannabis and so on, which actually wasn't illegal until the late 60s. Experiment with drugs and hippies and things like that, and the beginnings of the sexual revolution and so on. Sex began with the Beatles' first LP, so wrote Philip Larkin. So Wilson was having a hard time of it, and it called another election, 1966, and only a year and a half after the first one, and that March 1966 election went quite well with them. They got a majority of 96 seats. There was also the Rhodesia affair, as now Zimbabwe, the white minority wanting to virtually monopolise power, declaring independence on Remembrance Day 1965. They felt they'd been let down by the mother country. He wasn't backing them against the black majority. The black community obviously would like a say in the running of their ancestral homeland. So Wilson had that to contend with and thought sanctions would put paid to this illegal breakaway, but it didn't. It was an issue to separate for a further 14 years. So almost as soon as he'd won that second election, the pound lost a lot of value. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, James Callaghan, went on telly to say the pound in your pocket is not worth any less, which was a whopper of a lie. So there were some economic problems in the late 60s and a few more strikes, and people who'd given Labour a chance were wanting to see a significant improvement, and they weren't seeing it. Labour had been thought about various reforms about people's personal lives. 1967 decriminalised homosexuality in England and Wales, not in Northern Ireland or Scotland, and also permitting abortion under most circumstances. And I can't remember whatever, they loosened the divorce laws. The death penalty was suspended for 5 years in 1965, eventually abolished, and then pressurising the Unionist government in Northern Ireland to liberalise, but that gradually spiralled into the conflict there. So things going badly wrong for him in the late 60s. And so And there was rising immigration from various new Commonwealth countries, and then there was a backlash against that. Some white supremacists being bigoted against our Commonwealth cousins. And of course, April 1968, Enoch Poll, the Conservative MP for Wolverhampton South West, delivered his notorious Rivers of Blood oration in Birmingham, saying that non-white immigration was cataclysmic and that would all lead to a bloodbath. But was that supposed to be metaphorical from him? I hope so, but I fear not. Anyway, so by 1968, the Labour government was in deep trouble. And so people were thinking, well, action should be taken. And this rumour got around that really he was a Soviet agent. So Wilson was married, as I said, and he was very close to a woman called Marcia Faulkner, who was heavily involved in the Labour Party. She was married, she had children, was just slightly younger than him. And the 1950s, there had been relaxation in tensions of the Cold War. He'd gone on several trips to the Soviet Union, stayed in hotels in Moscow. Marcia Faulkner had happened to go with him and stay in another hotel room. Now, foreign diplomats, politicians, and so on, when they went to these hotels in the Soviet Union, the Soviet Secret Service, Komitet Государственной безопасности, would have the hotels that only they would stay in, and we've since seen what these hotels are like. That they would have behind the mirror would be a camera, one-way glass, recording devices, hidden video cameras everywhere, so they could spy on you. The idea is they could get blackmail material. We know this from various defectors. Moreover, when the Soviet Union broke up, some of these hotels were then sold on into private hands, and they're in places like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And some of the guys who own them and this is the room where you can be in with the camera through the one-way glass, filming people on the bed. And then if foreign visitors were told to beware of overly pliant Soviet females. But the suspicion is that he and Marcia Faulkner were having an affair, and that although they were in different hotel rooms in Moscow, they bed hopped and they spent the night together, and they could have been secretly filmed. And then the KGB confront them. Look, we've got this photographic, pornographic evidence of you committing adultery. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. Nobody's actually ever proven it. It remains a hypothesis. And then he was blackmailed to work for the Soviet Union. The idea is the KGB then they bump off Gateskill with poison, and they know how to do it. It's their method of choice for assassinating people they don't like abroad. This modus operandi has been used on numerous occasions. And then Wilson gets elected Labour leader, and that's that. And that really he's doing their bidding. Now, the thing is, it doesn't quite stack up because he didn't withdraw the UK from NATO. He didn't get rid of nuclear weapons. He didn't really do what the Soviet Union wanted. Now, it's true he didn't send troops to Vietnam, but that's because the Labour Party wouldn't wear it, and indeed the Conservative Party soon opposed it as well, so it would have had minimal public support. President Johnson is saying, well, come on, remember, we saved your arse in the Second World War. Only 20 years ago that ended, and we can create a run on the pound and things like that if you don't play ball with us. So Lyndon Baines Johnson was trying to strong-arm him, didn't work. Wilson just carried on puffing on his pipe. Huge protests in the mid-60s led by Tariq Ali against the Labour government speaking up for US policy. Wilson pretty soon stopped advocating for US policy. Admittedly, he didn't denounce it either because he knew he couldn't afford to offend Washington, D.C. too much. So Huey Green, the entertainer, was an ardent right-winger, supposedly contacted the commander of the British Army, the Rhine, about a coup d'etat. That's as in the British Army in West Germany. Remember, Germany was divided until 1990. And then British Army, Rhine, well, the commander told him to go whistle, that Wilson suspected MI5 was spying on him. MI5 is the United Kingdom's internal intelligence agency, trying to catch foreign spies in the UK and indeed spy on people within the United Kingdom or terrorists or would plot to overthrow the state, things like that. And he suspected they were spying on him. They were all real right-wingers. You should read Spycatcher by, oh God, I can't remember the name, Peter Wright, who was one of the sort of technical guys in MI5 from the 1930s, right through to the 70s when he retired. And in the 80s, he spilled the beans and said that this was going on. We're not quite sure if that's true. He retired to Tasmania, I think, to run a goat farm. And there was some sort of action against him when the British government tried to have the book banned, but it came out in Australia, wasn't allowed in the UK. And indeed, who was the barrister who spoke up in this Australian court for Peter Wright? It was a certain Malcolm Turnbull, later Prime Minister of Australia. So some right-wingers thought there had to be a coup d'etat. They couldn't wait till an election, and then they would do this in a very civilized way. And Wilson would simply be held under house arrest at Chequers, which is the government's, the Prime Minister's retreat in Buckinghamshire, his country house, because Viscount Leo Fareham gave that to the nation in his will. And this bequest was because he realised that future Prime Ministers might not all be from the landed classes and may not have a country seat. So ought to provide them with this rather than them suffer the indignity of being unable to invite foreign dignitaries to their country house. And Lord Mountbatten would be Prime Minister. Now, he probably wouldn't have played ball. For a man of his background, he was unusually left-wing and liberal. The idea he was a neutral person, sort of above the fray, related to the royal family, well, great-grandson of Queen Victoria. Now, there were lots of coups d'etats around the world in the 1970s. Greece, in 1967, the army had overthrown the democratic government, thinking it was too left-wing. There was a military dictatorship in Portugal at the time that fell in 1974. Spain was a dictatorship in the early 1970s. Only in 1975 it began to transition to democracy. And obviously in Eastern Europe, every country was a dictatorship. Many African and Latin American countries were having military coups all the time. So a military coup in the United Kingdom, perhaps it would not be unthinkable. On the other hand, people say, well, surely this simply won't do it. It was just unimaginable, given that the United Kingdom was a country that invented parliamentarianism. I suppose you can't say democracy, and that's from ancient Greece in a sense. And democracy as such came to the UK quite late, early 20th century. Bearing in mind, till the 20th century, almost nowhere had the right to vote for all men, and nowhere had the right to vote for all women until about 1892. Was it New Zealand first? So the early, coming up to the 1970 election, it looked like Labour was going to win again, not by much. In fact, the Conservatives under Edward Heath won. I won't go through the whole story, but 1974, Edward Heath called the election, and his slogan was "Who governs Britain?" Because he felt that strikes, and there were so many days to strikes, were trying to bring down the government. And people said, "Not you, mate. Who governs Britain? If you're the Prime Minister, if you even need to ask the question, well, then clearly you've lost your authority." So he lost, and the Labour government very narrowly won. It was neck and neck. Now, Heath could have been sustained as Prime Minister with Liberal support, with Jeremy Thorpe's Liberal Party forming a coalition. They discussed it. Thorpe wanted a referendum on proportional representation. Heath wouldn't commit to that. Both parties were unhappy about the idea of working together, and so Labour came back in. Incidentally, Wilson had quite a soft spot for Jeremy Thorpe, who because Wilson was a former Liberal, remember, as an undergraduate, and they got along on a personal level, whereas Wilson and Heath loathed each other. Heath was desiccated, reserved, very formal. As I think one Conservative Party image maker said, that she struggled to turn Edward Heath into a human being. Square-faced, very serious-minded, but cultured. Well, he liked conducting orchestras. He liked yachting and so on. Then all sorts of rumours, was he a homosexual? Like, is it Ian Harvey, that Labour MP who was exposed as gay? He dedicated his autobiography to those in peril on the sea. And people thought that was an oblique reference to Edward Heath, given on the basis he was a closet homo. I don't think Heath was, actually, but there we are. He never married, Heath, when he's one of only 3 British Prime Ministers never to marry, the others being A.J. Balfour and Pitt the Younger. So Wilson was back in government in 1974, and what a situation he had to take over. There'd been the 3-day week a little bit earlier under the Conservative government, because there'd been so many strikes by coal miners, power stations didn't have enough coal, people went without electricity so much. The Ulster conflict had exploded. There's a very high level of violence in Northern Ireland. There'd been truces, failed truces, things like that. 14 people had been shot dead by the Parachute Regiment in Derry. The IRA had obviously killed hundreds of civilians. So had the Loyalist terrorists. And that was that. And Wilson was talking about transitioning to hand Northern Ireland over to the Republic in about 15 years. In fact, it never happened. There was no end in sight to the Zimbabwe conflict, which, strictly speaking, was still a British colony, and the UK was not managing to resolve the issue. And obviously some real right-wingers thought the UK ought to back the white minority in Zimbabwe to the hilt, despite that be going against the rest of the world, and would probably shatter the Commonwealth. So the economy was stagnating, unemployment was rising, so it was a real witch's brew of an economic situation. The United Kingdom had just joined the European Economic Community on New Year's Day 1973, one of the few solid achievements of the Heath years. Edward Heath didn't marry either. Yeah, I said that, didn't I? And the Labour Party was riven by this European issue. So Wilson resolved it by putting it to the people, because he'd opposed joining in 1973, that act of accession 1972, not in principle, but on the basis that the terms offered were insufficient. So some renegotiations, some trifling concessions from Brussels, and then put it to the people in June 1975, and he suspended collective cabinet responsibility on that one issue. So cabinet ministers were free to campaign for or against staying in the EEC. It was a post-factum plebiscite. Referendum, I ought to say. And the Conservative Party was mostly pro-EEC, as was about half the Labour Party. The Liberal Party completely pro-it. The LC Unionists against, the SDLP for. The SNP, I think, were against. I'm not sure about Plaid Cymru. Anyway, so about 66% of people voted to stay in the EEC. 6 months earlier, the opinion polls had shown the other way around. So they managed to shift a third of the population's opinion. That was a tremendous result. But admittedly, they had the whole of Fleet Street on their side. So he'd resolved that issue. But people were talking about, oh, thank you, Jack and Nori. So book online lessons on history with me. But anyway, some people were still dissatisfied with him, felt that he'd been feeble on Northern Ireland, hadn't hammered the IRA and INLA, was unsupportive of the white supremacist regime in Zimbabwe. That's certainly true that he wasn't handling the economic situation, that the United Kingdom needed to feel the smack of firm government. And of course, in January 1975, Edward Heath had held a leadership election in the Conservative Unionist Party, hoping to bolster his own position. Well, but that really backfired on him, and he was voted out, and Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party in his stead, and we all remember how that turned out. So he also decided the UK needed to upgrade its nuclear weapons system. He didn't actually implement that. It was his successor, James Callaghan, who did. The CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was a major force in the UK by the early 70s. Certainly amongst the Labour Party, the junior generation, a great number of them were in the CND, and said that the United Kingdom should disarm unilaterally. Even if no other country got rid of nuclear weapons, just get rid of nukes. Better red than dead. People say, if we get rid of nuclear weapons, the Soviets will conquer us. That's still better than the human race being wiped out. So Wilson was convinced that MI5 was bugging him, they were plotting him against him, and there were listening devices in his official residence in 10 Downing Street, in his house and 5 Lord North Street, and so forth. And then in April 1976, he made the shock announcement that he would be retiring as Prime Minister. He'd reached the age of 60. I suppose he just couldn't stand the stress anymore, because it was an extraordinarily challenging time to be First Lord of the Treasury. So there was that shock announcement. And then just after he retired, he remained an MP to 1979. He spoke to a couple of young journalists, and they recorded him without his knowledge. And he was saying that he was convinced that MI5 were bugging him. Some people say that's nonsense. The guy was paranoid. Just because he's paranoid doesn't mean that his fears are misplaced. Maybe they really were, because they bugged lots of Labour MPs. And the idea that MI5 guys are real right-wingers. Now, the thing is, the UK's main adversary after 1945 was the Soviet Union. So you obviously don't want a communist in MI5. But do you want a Labour person? No, Labour people are not communists, but they have some sympathies in that direction. They might be quite opposed to US policy as being capitalist. So, and who does that leave? Liberals? Well, Liberals have a lot of qualms about spying on people, say we have to care about civil liberties. Conservatives don't have quite so many hang-ups. So no, not saying you have to be a card-carrying Tory to be a member of MI5, but if you're broadly a Tory mindset, you're more likely to feel at home there, and your loyalty not to be suspect. So I still don't know. And the one thing is that there had been the 50-year rule. A lot of sensitive documents weren't released for 50 years from MI5 or any government departments. Wilson reduced that to 30 years. So things from 30 years ago can then be released. But they didn't release everything, because I remember in 2003 studying things about the First World War, and some documents had only just been released. And looking through this document, I didn't see anything particularly embarrassing or anything that would impair national security in any way, things 85 years after the event. Why on earth were they keeping it under their hat? But I thought maybe the really damning documents still haven't been revealed. and heard about this, about the Sir Roger Casement files, because a historian I know, Professor Fitzroy Foster, well, emeritus, saying his neighbour was a civil servant in the 80s, and Foster's researching Casement, and this civil servant chuckling to him, "You'll never find out the truth about Casement," because this retired civil servant was given the job of going through the files and weeding out anything that could be damning. Okay, so that's that. He stood down. Perhaps it inspired A Very British Coup, that novel and later film by Chris Mullen, later Labour MP, the idea that they're all foam-flecked right-wingers in the security services, and they're always plotting down to bring down a Labour government. The plot of this film, A Very British Coup, well, the synopsis is there is a Northern Englishman who's a Labour MP, Labour Prime Minister indeed, and comes from a working class background, and yet the security services, they're always conspiring against him. So anyway, so it sounds rather like Harold Wilson. Anyway, that's enough about the plot against Harold Wilson. I'd love to get to the bottom of it and find out what really happened, but I suspect we shan't discover the verity for a few decades yet. So make sure you subscribe, really need you to subscribe, donate to me on Patreon and PayPal, book online lessons in all humanities subjects, get me to translate for you from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German and Russian, and book me as your tour guide in London. Okay, see me on Instagram, Facebook, and what's the other one? Oh, Twitter. Bye.